Thank you so much. The floor is open, including the floor over there. You're welcome to raise questions. Maya.
These both talks were so riveting, just riveting. And in thinking about dialogue and lyricism for you both, I'd really like to know whether in the novels and in the music under consideration for you both, whether there is a meaningful distinction between thought and externalized speech. That's something that I can't really settle for myself. And just to return for one quick second to the rejected Bakhtinian framework, because I think it amplifies what you're doing differently. Bakhtin, and I think under the pseudonym Voloshinov back in the Marxism, the philosophy of language, I mean, that framework blurs the difference between thought and speech by describing thought as inner speech that partakes of many of the public features of fully externalized speech, like adversivity and so forth. But it seemed to me that, Amanda, one of the kind of principled reasons behind your looking away from that is that the ruminative moment, the internalized moment, is doing quite a different kind of work from the character-to-character dialogue or the fully externalized confrontation. But at the same time, I was wondering if for you, the ruminative process does nevertheless partake of some of the more dramatic elements of the fully externalized speech acts. And then for Michael, there seems to be a particular intensity accumulating around those moments of lyricism that are in fact dialogue, like Marvin and Tammy and Ike and Tina. So I was just wondering if there's a particular intensity for you around those pairings. And the listen baby from Marvin and Tammy really stands out for me. It's an introductory phrase, but it also has this relationship to the bass line. Listen, dun, dun, dun. So I was just thinking about lyricism, the old model of lyricism related to the lyre, whether the bass line here it has that inextricable link to the lyric.
Okay, there we go. All right. Thank you for that very thought-provoking and speech-provoking question. Yeah, I think that, I mean, one of the things that's interesting about rumination is that often, so what, the psychologists often refer to what they call intrusive thoughts, right? So when they're talking about rumination as kind of an affliction that should be medicated, or at least hopefully will diminish. And so I do think that very interestingly, in many ruminations, I mean, I'm going to kind of answer this on two levels. In a specific rumination, there might be ways in which one feels that the thoughts that one is having are that one is not kind of authoring them, that they're just sort of occurring to one. I don't want to pathologize that, but I'm just saying that that's part of it. That's one level. But the other level, I think, is that, that thought in language, and this is controversial, but I don't think all rumination is in language. It certainly isn't, because it's visual. There's so much of it is visual, but there's, that thought in language, it's not like it's fully private language or anything like that, that it's playing on and working through all sorts of public forms of speech. So maybe ultimately, like, it could be reconciled with a Bakhtinian model. I just wanted to signal that I wasn't going to talk about that, but I really appreciate your pushing me on that. Yeah, I think, and then this notion that you're asking me about, like, is there kind of a distinction, a crucial distinction in kind between what takes place, kind of in the interior thought process and then through action, through speech. I don't know if I'd quite put it like that, but what strikes me is that, the thing I'm interested in rumination is this kind of like nagging focus on some sort of, violated commitment or value, right? So rather than it all being about ego wounding, which is, again, the sort of one standard way to talk about it and to say, this isn't good, stop doing it. Rather than it being about ego violation, which can be involved, okay, or ego wounding, or narcissistic wounding. That rather it's about a violated dignity, a violated principle. It's like, this is wrong, and I'm going to think about it and think about it and think about it, and maybe I'm going to say something, and maybe I'm not going to say something, and and that's part of a moral process. So I don't know if that helps.
No, thanks for that, Maya. I think to talk about the start, the just listen thing, I started there because have always been preoccupied with that. First is the rim shot, then it's listen. And I can't decide whether the just is part of the rim shot or disappears into the baseline like you're talking about, right? It's like so masterful from them. And to your point about this dialogue, right? It's almost, this is what we were talking about this morning. We've had this long conversation over years about this question of a mastery of a particular form that allows that type of innovation within the confines of it, right? That in many ways is appears to be a type of, and this is back to what Bonnie was saying this morning about almost a type of linguistic magic, right? That calls into existence a particular thing, right? So I want to start there with this, like telling you to listen while at the same time saying, there's all this other stuff beneath that because then I want to get at the depth of just that commentary. So no, that's why it was so important. And the dialogue, both between the artist and the dialogue of the artist with particular phenomena at the same time form, at the same time political context that informs the entire conversation was what I was trying to do with that part of it.
Thank you both so much. I have a question for each of you. So for Michael, it's really about the lyrics in lyricism.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you could have done another talk if you'd just done the music and the lyricism of the music without the lyrics. So that interplay, it was clearly an interesting choice to show these kind of riveting photographs and then the lyrics. But what was the missing piece? And it made me think a bit about, again, the conversation this morning about what do you put in what do you take out when you're talking about a musical gesture. I don't think that's what you were doing, but it's so the question is the lyrics and the lyricism. And then for Amanda, okay, a fellow obsessive over political fiction. Wow, that's really, it's been a private sort of thing for me well, not so private, it was in my last book, but, and so that's why I read Phineas Finn and Coningsby and, His Excellency Rougon-Macquart, all of these novels that were considered unreadable, especially because they had pages and pages of parliamentary debate and what Moretti would call filler, where they're talking about some little, not even a big thing like Suez or Panama, but just the latest gossip on, and it's all about, for me, how politics kind of happens in social discourse, and also how certain kinds of political legislation actually is debated in a moment. So it almost crosses over into historical fiction at that point. And so I wondered if you would count that as rumination, because it is a kind of just of dialogic rumination, but what kind of decision does it result in? Well, nothing personal necessarily, although you do get people reflecting on those conversations later. So I don't know, it's a sprawling question. But.
So I took the music out, so we would focus on the literary nature of their prose in a particular way, right? Or poesis, basically. And what it did for me at the same time is that the music never goes away because you can still hear it, right? It's become so inextricably linked one to the other, just like what Maya was saying, like that Listen Baby recalls like this whole thing. So now when you hear it, and like I said, now I can't stop but hear the just that belongs there, but that Marvin has taken out, right? And so I was trying to get at that by taking that out, then adding the element of just seeing them, added the kind of visual part that I wanted to include with this notion of the senses that are running at the time, but then some of them become almost unconscious that are happening because it's become so linked and synergistic in a particular way, right? And so the reason I wanted to, when I was asked what I wanted to do, I said lyricism almost without thinking about it, just because I want to think about the way that the lyrical and the lyric is always more than itself, right? And if you really like, I become preoccupied with like a single lyric for like days, and I'll listen to it over and over and over again, and it just becomes so much more than itself, right? And then what I was trying to do is see how they link to one another through this kind of really elaborate chain that you can trace, like this kind of flowing thing. So that's why I took the music. Like one thing I was going to do, I thought about like including the snippet of the lyric of the song actually, but I thought it would be disruptive to what I wanted to do with like taking that away for a second to get it back to literature in a particular way, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. I guess I want to say just with respect to Trollope, like, I think not. Like, I think there is one really interesting moment in Phineas Finn where the narrator personifies the party that's in charge and has it sort of thinking about, how it's going to balance its sort of like what it thinks it can achieve. But I don't think I would call that the some of the kind of, I guess we'll say, the tedious conversations about politics actually rumination. So I'll think more about that though. Thanks.
Hi, I also have a question to both of you. And for some reason, they are both really tangential rather than directly relating. Closer, rather than directly relating. Does it work? Directly relating to your talks. Amanda, for me, it was more about the concept of rumination than on the concept of dialogue. And I wanted to know a little more about that choice, but probably mainly because I have always been intrigued by novels that I read that were very dear to me and I thought were fantastic novels, except the dialogue. I came always to the point thinking, why did he not choose an editor to edit the dialogues? Or, I have two examples. One is Richard Powers in his earlier work. Actually, his later work, the dialogues are better. And then the other one is Octavia Butler in her science fiction. Everything is outstanding for me, except some of the dialogues just fall flat as compared. And I thought a lot about what the reason for that could be. And then I wondered if there's something that has to do with the attempt to do dialogues realistically. Because for me, the most fascinating dialogical novel with dialogues is Ivy Compton Burnett's novel where all the dialogues are about things people would never say in public, but it's as if the unsaid is voiced as a form of dialogue. And that did something that worked perfectly. So for me, the question is, can one even link it to Bonnie this morning brought in the concept of performative failures? Can one bring that in relation to certain dialogues, and why is it? And then for Michael, I was intrigued, and I wonder if you would agree. I heard a kind of subliminal scientific dialogue underlying, you mentioned things like, in passing, the quantum nature of reality. Another time, the concept of temporal plasticity. And I even saw in your remarks about chaos, about catastrophe, I thought subliminal references to catastrophe theory were there. Did I hear that right?
Yeah.
Okay, so these are my questions.
Okay, sure. Okay, yeah. So, okay, yeah, we'll do a little full disclosure on the choice of the concept. I did go back and forth. I thought about doing rumination as the concept. I had a desire to work through a particular problematic, which was thinking about the relationship between particularly kind of like charged moments of moral argument in dialogue with, and relate that to the work on rumination. So I had like a specific formal issue I wanted to work through. And so I made the concept dialogue to force myself to do that. And I also had given a talk on rumination at Brown in October. So I was trying to sort of push, you know. So that's, but so it's totally fair to say that the truly cathected concept is rumination, I think. I mean, because it is. I mean, you know, at some level. Okay, so on the matter of like dialogue itself just seeming artificial, forced, and failed, yeah, I mean, I think one can experience that. I think it has something to do actually with the sort of the typographical and the marking of, you know, the he said, she said, when, you know, if you're reading free and direct discourse, it's just much more elegant and smooth and all of that. So I think that part of it is just, yeah, I mean, it's a feature of it seeming a little bit crude. But I think what I'm really interested in is moments where, and some of it does seem honestly a little bit like the unsaid. You know, some of these moments of like in confrontation. And I think one thing that's really cool about Trollope is he presents lots of relationships where people keep getting in the same argument, which is like, you know, so realistic, but you never see it in novels, you know. And so that's one of the things, like, I mean, I didn't go into it, but like Lady Laura keeps confronting her husband over and over again after having these long ruminations. So, and they're almost, there's a kind of unreality about it. You think, would this really happen? This kind of easy transit. But I think that Trollope is profoundly interested in that. And it's what really makes his novels stand out. And I alluded to this briefly, but in somebody like Eliot, say in Middlemarch, you have like Dorothea ruminating about, you know, her feeling like her husband, you know, doesn't care about her, or Mrs. Bulstrode after she finds out that her husband, you know, after the scandal about her husband is exposed, they enter into ruminations that last like about an hour. And then they go forth with moral aspiration to, like, you know, not necessarily have a conversation, but to just carry on. And Eliot is sort of like, doesn't like, I mean, I think she's very spooked by unproductive rumination. So I mean, that's a sort of wandering answer, but I hope it partly suffices.
Yeah, just so I'm a really bad aerospace engineer. I barely graduated from college with that as my, like, when I was studying, like literally barely graduated. But I've always been preoccupied with time in that way. So a lot of that work, I felt bad about my performance in school, but I didn't feel bad about the things that I learned and the way that I can still apply them. And so it clarifies a lot of things for me. And I think that my first book was on temporality, and this is kind of further pushing along that, because I really think that there's something going on with musical time kind of broadly defined, and as it relates to a project of expressing particular type of historical moments. So that's what I was up to.
Yeah, so you would link the temporal plasticity also to a kind of lyrical time.
Absolutely.
Plasticity in
Yeah.
lyrical time. Yeah.
Question for each of you. Michael, you know, the Gladys Knight and the Pip track that you cited, it's a very interesting thing that urban sociologists, when they talk about migration and the hopes with which, especially from the country to the city, migrations have come in every corner of the world, they come with very high hopes, and very often, if urban sociologists' reports are right, it's much worse off. They're very often much worse off here. They're in slums, the water is poisoned in the slums, the kids are joining gangster groups and violent, and so there's just kind of freezing in your own hell. There's almost no reverse migration. If the sociologists are right, it's very rare. And that just shows what a tremendous projective momentum hope has. That, it's a forward movement and it very seldom steps back. And so that's a very poignant thing where it's declaring itself, and so lyricism is just so made for it in a way, because there's the forward movement and the stepping back. So I really got a very poignant sense of what you were after in that. So I wanted to just register that. And Amanda, I was wondering whether the rumination that you sort of counterpoised with dialogue, a moral dialogue, whether it's particularly ruminative, or rumination seems to be particularly apt, when the dialogue is between the powerful and the powerless. Because prima facie, we think when there's just the powerful and the powerless completely, there's no point in dialogue, because our general sense is the dialogue is between roughly equals, right? And if it's whatever else there is, dialogue is not what's apt when it's the complete power over the powerless. You might go on the street, you might go to violence, but the idea of a dialogue tends to be, our instinctive response is, what's the point? You don't have dialogue with the master. The master is your master. And so in that context, where we are completely dismissive of dialogue as being appropriate, I'm wondering if a recovery of energy and so on is where the rumination is particularly apt, for the powerful to develop regret or guilt through rumination, for the powerless to recover energy and so on. It may be particularly apt when the moral dialogue is inflected by power in that way. It's just.
I just want to say yes and thank you. I mean, I think that's a wonderful description. I just would make one point of clarification, that I think when you say dialogue, you kind of mean real dialogue, because of course in the novel there's all sorts of represented dialogue between the powerless and the powerful, and Simon During even has this argument about how something called conversational democracy covers over all sorts of problems of power. But with that one little footnote, yes, absolutely. That's really helpful. Thank you. Especially the time to recover and the time to energize. I like that.
Thanks, Akeel. Yeah, so right before that lyric, Gladys Knight says, he sure found out the hard way that dreams don't always come true, right? He had to pack up all his stuff and go home, right? Which is, to your point, right, the migration, which is in counterpoint to what George Benson does in Broadway, right? Because he says he goes to Broadway and he succeeds, right? He's like, he shows up, he has barely enough to get his shoes shined, but he can make it work on Broadway, right? So what Gladys Knight is doing is putting him back on this train to go back down south to reverse the actual migration west that was happening, right? That's had, to your point, had so much promise, but ended up in this kind of failure, right? And the question is whether it's failure or not to return to this home, and then to bring the person that you love back with you, who goes along. So that's what I was exploring there, right? It's this question of this failure, but it's a question of failure, but then has its like place of a particular type of love act that goes along with, like, making it all okay at some point, right? To go back home and just start all over again, right? The one-way ticket back. He's not going to try it again at this point in the story, right? So that's why I'm glad that came through in the.
I just had a question for Michael. And this kind of sort of relates to the sort of method of the talk, right? So you have all these tracks from different sort of modes of expression, poetry, interviews, song lyrics. And it seems like, maybe one way to describe the method, and you can certainly feel free to disagree with this characterization, is that like the the connection between them is often sort of like your own kind of lyric riffs running through the talk, right? Though that proves the sort of connection between all of these different modes, right? But so as I'm sort of like listening to the talk, also for me, just because I'm familiar with a lot of these references and some of the material you cite, was that there are moments for me where the sort of the way that the example was sort of discussed by the artist, or the history of the artifact, right, is in tension with your lyric voice running through it, right? So there's sort of substrate. So just a couple of examples for me, the Hughes poem, right? The Negro Speaks of Rivers poem, Hughes disavows the romanticism of that poem and the sort of fantasy of African, sort of African return at the center of it, and so forth. In that interview with Coltrane that you referenced, right? One of the sort of like central tensions in the interview with Coltrane is like the interviewer is sort of trying to impose all these interpretations on his style, and Coltrane basically sort of keeps insisting, he's like, there are all these sort of technical things that I'm doing as a professional musician, experiments with form that I'm trying to work through. You read that as me being angry, but it's just a sort of technical experiment. You're imposing your ideology on my effort to master technique, right? So just to say that, like, so I guess the bigger question for me is sort of like, how do you understand the relationship between your kind of lyric voice that's sort of running as a thread through all these materials, and those moments where there are other accounts of like understanding that lyric voice, whether it's technique or Hughes's kind of like own meditations on the inadequacy, say, of his own political expression in that poem. So how do you negotiate those registers?
Yeah, so it's appropriationism, right? So
I wouldn't call it that.
No, you know what I mean. So yeah, so I'll start with the Coltrane thing, which was the one really divergent thing, because I was looking for a way to express the non-lyrical, the lyricism of his instrumental performance, right? And basically, in his debate, that comes out of the 1960, when he's basically booed, right? Because if you listen to that recording, they try to excise the sound, but people are whistling, and that's the way they're booing in Europe, because they can't understand what he's doing at all, right? And the interviewer, you're right, is saying that people say it's an angry sound, and I'm not saying that John Coltrane doesn't know what he's doing, but I'm not sure that his technical exploration has particular resonance with people who are hearing that are similarly situated, right? And I think that there's a way in which, and he's particular, the reason I went to Alabama there is like, he said that was meant to mimic the kind of sound and timbre of Martin Luther King's eulogy of the 16th Street Baptist Church thing. So he's in that space, right? And so 3 years after that notion and that interview, he's working on this question of how can he express the more beautiful lyrical line, to this point we were on this morning with Maya's intervention, where the blues become this exposition of a particular type of event of horror that then has beautiful representation in a particular way, right? And he's searching for the technical ways in which to express that. So I'm not sure that in the interview that he's giving, and there's some other interviews that I thought of using too, where he's asked specifically about his relationship to Malcolm X's speech, right? He's up in Harlem. He's trying to resist letting himself become political, because he doesn't want to be perceived as a political artist in that way, for whatever reason, right? I don't think it's opportunistic or a reason to kind of exclude himself from that conversation. But I think he's really trying to figure out how to speak directly to people without having the instrument or technique be the limitation of that, if that makes sense. So what I was trying to do in mining those lyrics, and even the Langston Hughes, right, it's like Langston Hughes may feel like like he's disavowing this, but it sounds a heck of a lot like what the river is supposed to represent, right? And what Langston Hughes may not even at that stage have understood about in the relationship to what we now know about a lot of things, right? And post that moment about the historical moment of the rivers, the what that all means, and what Muddy Waters and these people are talking about is kind of flowing back and forth, right? Because Langston Hughes is writing from a particular type of residence up in Harlem, and he's talking about rivers that are primarily something that people care about in the Mississippi, and all these things are happening at the same time. So what I was trying to do is take all that mess together and take the things that I needed from it in order to kind of weave what I thought was to be a kind of coherent narrative, while acknowledging the fact that, yeah, there's all kinds of other readings about this, right? That's why the lyric is just that, and the lyrical is just that, right? It gives us an opportunity for a particular type of latitude. And I was trying also not to do violence to their text, right? Not to take it completely out of a context, but to say that there's a reading of this that will allow you to see how it fits with these other kinds of things. Is that? I was not trying to do kind of a straight kind of hermeneutics of the lyrics, if that makes any sense.
So officially, we have just 5 minutes. We can still a few more, but try to shorten your questions, please. Irvine.
I feel like I did after your talk. I have 500 questions. I'm going to try to limit it to 1 or 2. They were, Amanda and Michael, both really beautiful talks, beautiful writing, and beautiful performances. I was also really interested in method and sort of, I was analyzing sort of the formal, like really beautiful linear argument kind of going along with you. And then on yours, I was like on this ride where I'm like, am I going up? Am I going down? Am I a spiral? What's happening? Okay, so my question is for you, Michael. First, it's about the political concepts that seem to be haunting the talk. So the absent just seems to be an invitation to think about justice, which is not something that you address directly. Listen as an imperative is also an invitation to an ethical relation. It's an invitation to speak to another. And then in the wonderful Ellison quote, to see around corners is enough. That is not unusual when you are invisible, but to hear around them is too much. It inhibits action. So obviously action, it speaks to the kind of political ambivalence of the novel. So I wonder if you could speak to that, but I'm really, really interested in how you're kind of privileging the sonic, but you're referring to visuality as well. And it seems to me this idea of seeing around corners and hearing around corners being too much might be a way to think through it. So seeing around corners, hearing around corners, I think in physics would be sonic diffraction. Visual, I don't think there's visual diffraction. Visual refraction is just seeing. In other words, diffraction is what happens, right, when light enters the lens inside your body and then reports to your brain what's happening. So it's what we perceive as something that seems immediate, but in fact is highly mediated and maybe even distortion a little bit. Whereas sonic refraction is a sound wave, sound diffraction is a sound wave hitting some sort of barrier, right, having to move around it. And then sonic diffraction is something else entirely, refraction is something else entirely. I think hearing around corners would pertain to sonic diffraction. So how do these, and I'm like speaking as an elementary non-physics student, how do these sort of accounts from physics of visual and sonic experience through the literary and through the lyrical get us to possible haunting ethical or political concepts like listening or justice or action?
Okay. So the kind of hearing around corners thing is, so I'll back into this and Roland can help with this. I'm convinced that the reason Ellison couldn't organize his last novel because he refused to hear around corners, right? And he refused to hear around corners because he won't deal with the avant-garde. He won't deal with multiple voices at the same time. He wants to have a single voice because Invisible Man is a solo, right? It's a solo performance. And what happens is he can't he like explicitly disavows the cacophony of the avant-garde. It's like there's too many things going on at the same time. And my argument is that what Coltrane is telling you is that there's a line through it, right? And it's a line that and I'm using synesthesia here, right? It's neither, and I could have said this, right? It's neither visual nor sonic. It's both at the same time, right? It's almost like I'm preoccupied. Emily, I've been talking, like I'm preoccupied with dogs in a particular way. And if you ever notice when someone's left the room and a dog knows it, you can watch them like trace where the person's been, like with their nose. And it's like, I just wonder what that looks like on their brain, right? It's like they can see, like literally can see, and you can see how they age it and follow where the individual happened to be, right? So, and that's, to me, is smelling around corners, right? So what I'm saying is that really what's happening is the around corners thing is different than refraction, because what it's really doing is pulling the phenomena immediately to your system of cognition, where there's nothing between the thing, and your response to the thing, right? This is what I was saying that I believe Coltrane's up to with his exploration, right? He wants he wants to render it unmediated, right? Where you're just getting sound, and the sound becomes visual, it becomes tactile, it becomes all kinds of things at the same time. So the hearing around corners becomes, in many ways, back to this question we've had permeating the conference about metaphor, right? It becomes metaphor for a lot of different things. And I ran out of time because really you can go to Hendrix with this, right? Where Jimi Hendrix begins in Bold as Love, where he goes through all these colors and tells you how each one feels, right? Blue is the water, green is the, on and on and on, right? He's telling you what this feels like. And so that's what I'm trying to do with that, right? To say that there's a way of feeling, being, and that, to your question, then justice or just or listening become a kind of corporeal practice, and also a kind of political act that artists can respond to, that audiences can respond to in kind of dialogue, and that necessarily systems of thinking need to respond to that kind of energy that's happening, right? So what I want to do is place the artist and the artist's relationship to the audience as a prime mover for something like political action towards justice, if that makes any sense. Yeah. Need the mic.
Sorry, I probably need a microphone. Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. So I joined the chorus in appreciating the papers and the panel. Thanks to both of you. And Amanda, I have a question for each of you. They're related. Amanda, I'm trying to think with you about dialogue and rumination, so I hope I haven't got anything wrong. Sort of looking for the edges and overlaps between the two of them. And so starting with the 2-in-1 of thinking, which Arendt says pulls you out of the world with others. That's what thinking does. And I'm thinking about how that means, and I think she says this, that one way to stop it is to re-enter the world, to re-engage with others. And so then it's in that context that I'm thinking about what you said about Lady Standish, because how else would I know what she does except from you, that she ruminates, and then she goes and picks a fight with her husband, basically, is what you made it sound like. She engages with him after a period of rumination, and that's a kind of dynamic with her. And that suggests two possibilities. And one is that the rumination is a preparation for the encounter, that she's sort of figuring out what she thinks so she can have an encounter that's, meaningful or well-informed. But the other is that the encounter is sought to end the doldruming of rumination. And that may be morally harmful to him. It's not fully respectful to him because that's a use of him in a way. And that would explain her guilt, which you admire her for, rightfully, that she seems to know she hasn't done right by him. It's one more way in which maybe she's not doing right by him. And then I was thinking about how in the former, where the rumination is preparation for the encounter, it might be a kind of self-talk, which is something kind of maybe in between rumination and dialogue, I'm not sure. A self-talk in relation to those intrusive thoughts that are pathologized that way. Or it could be a practicing for real dialogue, so again, just to restate the contrast. And I was thinking about how I do this sometimes. I shouldn't confess these things in public, but sometimes, you running a conversation that you had with someone, especially if you didn't say exactly the right thing that you wanted to say. And you'll be walking outside and suddenly like the exclamation that you should have had comes out of your mouth and you look like an idiot. Not anymore because people have cell phones now, so everybody's doing that. But we're suddenly like, you just want to win that argument still, and it just comes out of you instead of staying inside of you. Does this happen to anyone else? Okay, good. Just checking. So all of those are kind of, ruminative to ask in what way, how we can find the edge where it's discrete and how these two are related, whether in a prefigurative or postfigurative kind of way. So I find the topic endlessly interesting. And then relatedly, Michael, I was wondering about how in the cases of the pairings where you had 2 or 3, I think, examples that were people singing with other people, I was thinking about, I wanted to know more about how the harmony, because I know all those songs, and they harmonize, and I wondered about the harmony in the pairings performances, how to think about that harmony as in relationship to lyricism, but also in relationship to thinking, because one way to understand Arendt on thinking is that you are trying to be in harmony with yourself. So that split that thinking creates in you between you and yourself doesn't have to be resolved in a unitary sovereignty. It can be resolved in a kind of harmony. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that. And thanks again to both of you.
No, I think the best example for that for me, and I'll send you these Ike and Tina Turner performances, right? Everything we know about this, right? If you listen to this, Ike is like singing in this like baritone behind her. Like every single lyric, he's like tracing it behind her. She's singing just above him, and it works. But it works in like this kind of really negative way because you know what's really going on with them. And it's like so scary at the same time, right? Because she's haunted by this voice behind her that's like literally saying the same thing as her, like guiding it at the same time. She's free of it during the performance, but afterwards that the control completely shifts, right? Yeah. And then these kinds of positive moments of harmony, particularly with the Marvin Gaye and Tammy Terrell, and even the Sly and the Family Stone stuff, right? Because that whole performance is so like the whole family, like each person runs through, they have a particular part that they sing, right? And it's just a simple song, right? It's like the most uplifting, like you go back and listen to Sly's music, right? It's like the Summertime song, right? Everybody's a star, right? Single simple song, right? Happy, right? It's like he's just out here just doing whatever, man. It's like, and it's a positive kind of harmony, but at the same time, to your point, right? This is also gets created from the chaos of relationship between Ike Turner and Tina Turner that delivers you a particular type of aesthetic object that is also commensurate with a need for kind of further exploration as to what's really going on and why this tension becomes something that's interesting in that same way.
So yeah, thank you so much for that, Bonnie. I mean, I think the first thing I would say is just that there's a plurality of ways in which different authors represent rumination, different people experience rumination, different people have a tolerance for it. I'll just say as an aside, I do make a distinction between obsession and rumination. So I'm not going to go into that, but I just will say that, as you can tell from the paper, I'm trying to sort of take rumination seriously as a kind of moral, I don't want to say practice because it's like, but that's part of how I might describe it, though that sounds maybe a little too ongoingly self-conscious. Some people make friends with it. Some people want to stop it. And yes, I don't think it's true that Lady Laura Standish is picking fights, nor do I think that I wouldn't judge her negatively because there's just a kind of devotion to sincerity, lucidity, like moral clarity that's really astonishing. And this is one of Trollope's great, like signature achievements is the way he represents, particularly women, as sort of like morally clear thinking and speaking creatures. But I think I would just say like it really varies. And I don't think, I think the whole question of like speech as a way to stop it is, that can happen, but I also think that it's really important to kind of honor and acknowledge the ways in which rumination, it can yield many things. It can yield quietude and resignation, but I mean, it can also yield a decision to confront and challenge. And, I'm interested in those moments, particularly as they relate to certain moments in novels where there's a kind of instance of, let's just call it like heroic speech that has to do precisely with power.
Okay, thanks very much. I think I'm going to, my question is kind of a bit dumb, I think, but I've been sort of looking for the answer. It's to Amanda, and I think it's a version of what Roland asked to Michael, but I want to ask the same question to Amanda. And it's something like, it's about the question of representation. So there are represented, and you've talked about it in many of your answers, and it's really interesting. There are represented ruminations, and then there are ruminations that take place within certain novels. And I'm wondering, is there a way in which you formally can distinguish between represented ruminations that are intended to remain within the sort of like the diegetic scene and that are confined to a character and that may be in some sense unreliable, or ruminations that are in fact where the novel is doing political work? Are there formal characteristics whereby one can make that kind of distinction? And the example I was thinking of is Conrad's The Secret Agent or The Return, where you just get these, use the word obsession, obsessive, sort of pathological, they read to me like ruminations, but they are confined within a particular character's working something out, but working something out in a way that is so perverse and so weird. I'm teaching a course on Ishiguro this semester. Ishiguro's novels are also full of these perverse ruminations. And so what is so it's also partly about, is for you the importance of rumination or the novel and rumination, that this is where the novel does political thinking? Or is it that the novel represents a form of rumination that for you is important? I guess that's another sort of side question.
Yeah, I would say to the second, yes. Okay. But to the first question that you just asked, is rumination where the novel does political work? I would not make that assertion. In other words, that's too absolute an assertion. Like I would not say, this is where we find it. I mean, I was saying that one place we also find political work is in character argument in the political novel and in the novel of ideas, right? So I just, I think it is, and I'm not even sure, honestly. I mean, I would say rumination is a place where the novel can and often does moral, psychological, and ethico-political, and political work. In other words, it's like, or it's it's a complex, and it sort of depends. And yes, there's a, we live in the age of psychology, and there's an intent, have for quite a while, and there's an intense interest among many writers in the psychological and pathological dimensions of rumination, without necessarily having some, like, seeing it in the way that I'm inviting people to see it, as taking place within certain novels, that is within certain characters, as part of a kind of moral trajectory or moral processing. And yeah, I think that I'll leave it at that, though I know I didn't answer the formal thing. I will talk to you later. I feel like, are we running out of time?
Almost, yes. Last question. Yeah.
Very, very quickly, would you say that what you mean by rumination, if you take a kind of hoary, Janwati view of the development of the novel out of the epic form, would you say that the rumination is associated with sort of those moments in epic when you get a pastoral interlude and reflection occurs upon the action of the epic?
That's really, really fascinating suggestion. All I can say is I'll think about it. It's not a thought I have ever owned, but I will think about it. Thank you.
That's a wonderful answer for this hour. Thank you. We are taking a break. 15 minutes, we'll be back.